indeed, the death penalty for food safety violation. Yeah. But it was existing before. So there's the rule. The problem is implementation. Cold chain is indeed an issue, but I don't think it's the only main issue. I mean, in the case of milk, for example, the real issue is that I think is attraction to quick bucks. And then you have basically a lack of education and people being attracted to, to a quick amount of money in unethical way. So I think to me it goes much further in terms of, education of the farmers, a concept of doing ethical business in China, etc., etc. But coaching is only, I would say, one of the many issues. In our case, for us, we have 31 factories in China, over 50,000 people. In one of our biggest factories, we have over 120 quality engineers to check products. Each product is going through 200 different quality checks before it goes out. Because I often say in terms of quality, don't sound arrogant, but probably no financial institution can afford to buy Nestle. So financially, we're pretty safe. We're so big. The only thing which could bring this company down, and very quickly, would be a major food safety issue, which could literally kill this company.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just to answer maybe quickly on the food, how does the food is the issue of people being hungry in developing world, and especially lady from India probably knows more than that about me, but I was 4 years in Pakistan looking after Nestle, and the big issue we had there is, for example, mangoes. Over 40% of the production didn't even reach the market. So you have roads, you have processing, So we need, what you mentioned in your introduction, we need to move processing plants as much upstream as possible. And this is why, for example, our dairy factories are not in Shanghai, but they are in Heilongjiang and Inner Mongolia. There's a reason why, because it happens that the cows don't stand too much warmth and humidity. And it's the same for any kind of food production. So that's I would say, the main issue of access to market. And the developed country, you said, in many countries, again, the issue, it's a bit the same point as the first one. In many countries, the issue is less the availability of food from a production point of view, but what is wasted in the whole supply chain part. But I would say clearly, what we can do is really encourage, we're doing it in China, we're encouraging investors to invest into processing of raw material, be it milk, be it grain, etc. But of course, a return on investment, talking about trading, etc. If food investing in farming, we're talking 10, 12% ROIC. We're not talking 30, 40%. So it's all a question of where's the money going in terms of investment.
Hubert, I'd like to have you add something to the conversation. You can stand up if you want.
Okay, thank you.
You don't have to.
I was trying to benefit from the comfort of the armchair, I think. But I was introduced as a statistician, but I will not speak as a statistician here. My first introduction to global supply chain were a long time ago when I worked in El Salvador in 1992 on project trying to create jobs for the ex-warriors. I mean, ex-army or ex-guerrilla, and also the displaced population. And looking at the potential for job creation, at that time there were many firms working on textile, etc., etc. So it was my first introduction to global supply chain. And when I came back to this subject, and thanks to what we have been doing in WTO and that, and what the Fung Institute is doing, I found a very close relationship between what development economists use as a concept to develop value chain on the field, and what we heard about Nestle and working with peasant is an example. It's called the cluster approach, which is used by many development economists, especially after the work of Michael Porter, and the logic of you people in the business community working on global value chain. And I guess this is a very important aspect, because it's not usual to have this link between global business and the development economist and the social worker on the field. So I mean, it would be my first point, that we have here a potential. Victor said this morning that it was important not to work in silos. And when you work on cluster, you really work on network. So you try to break the silos, the traditional silos that exist at country level between the people interested in agricultural development, industrial development, etc., etc. So I guess this is very important. But my contribution will be on three risks I came to identify, because my first move when I started working on that was enthusiasm about global value chain and its relationship with cluster. And after I came to realize that there are three misunderstandings that we have to avoid when we refer to global value chain and cluster development. The first misunderstanding, potential misunderstanding, is the difference in upgrading strategy between what development economists think of upgrading in clusters and what business people may think of upgrading in a global value chain. And when you work on a cluster as a development economist, you will try to increase the domestic value of your product, getting more peasants, for example, working and linking them with logistics and et cetera, et cetera. When you work on upgrading in a global value chain, and Victor said, I mean, one month to the other one, you may change totally your strategy. Because when you deal with global supply chain management, you optimize your value from an international perspective. So this is the first possible misunderstanding that we would like to, I mean, if I had the time, I would like to work more on that. The second one is the possible conflict between upgrading and job creation. And I would like here to refer to this nice diagram, which is called the smiley diagram or the smile diagram. When you're a firm and you want to increase your value added per unit of output, you have to try to not to be at the bottom on but try to go up ever on the left side of the graphs with more research and development, etc., or on the right side. I mean, more marketing, branding, I mean, more market power. But here, you'll be creating more value added per unit, but less jobs. And when you work on social development and your interest is to fight poverty, you might be more interested in staying at the bottom of the curve and to substitute high value added by high volumes. I say, which is also a business strategy. I mean, it can be very good for a business to specialize in low value added per unit, but to have high volume. I understand that in the business strategy it's called horizontal upgrading. So I mean, you're doing the same. So it's the second possible misunderstanding I wanted to point. And the third one is the relationship between upgrading and global value chain and the transfer of technology. For a development economist, the transfer of technology from so-called developed country to developing country is very important in the sense that you start working with higher technology, you can expect to have higher wage, etc., etc. But it creates, in my opinion, an increasing gap between the small and medium firms in a country which are still working on the traditional way of working and the standards you need to attain in terms of quality, in terms of code of conduct, I mean, and the way you manage your firm in order to be able to join a global value chain. So this increasing gap, when you upgrade, may in fact reduce the impact of global value chain on the social development in your country. And here, and I will conclude on that, Patrick, don't look at me with your eyes. I conclude. I was very much interested when you say that today global value chains are no more producing to sell in developed countries, which means perhaps with quality standards, etc., that are far away from the supply condition of poorest countries, but that nowadays you sell where you make the product. So perhaps here there is a possibility of reducing this gap, this technology gap between the possibilities of local producers, farmers, etc., and the demand of the consumer. And with that, Patrick, I stop.
Okay, that's very interesting points you raised. Now, Howard's going to put you right on a couple of points.
Well, I'm excited to hear what Roland has mentioned and also Victor has mentioned, which really is an opportunity, I think. The opportunity is that I think Roland described the potential problems faced by the developing world, which is the people going hungry. In fact, I think 1.3 billion people in the world lives below 1.25 US dollars a day, and this is extreme poverty. So there's a huge, huge need besides food. They don't have anything, basically. But yet, I think what Victor says is also true, is that many of these potential problems perhaps can be addressed by people who are very good in supply chain. We are supposed to be experts in supply chain and helping multinationals, helping big corporations to be efficient in the regular supply chain, industrial goods supply chains. But we can actually apply the same of maybe methodologies or maybe perspective to help to bridge that gap that Roland was describing. For example, in Africa, one of the major logistics problems that Victor has mentioned about delivery of food, delivery of healthcare, delivery of anything, is impossible because of the lack of the logistics infrastructure. And yet, motorcycles was a very powerful means. Motorcycles can go where there are no paved roads, and we can apply these kind of supply chain methodologies in maintenance, in helping them to provide oil filters, spare parts to deliver goods, and that's proven to be successful in Zambia, in Gambia. We can also think about, when we talk about designing products and developing products for those developing countries and not give them the leftovers, which I mentioned earlier, is that in the old stuff, okay, give it to the developing world. No, we design things specially for them, and that's what happens. Successful examples are designing light systems, designing irrigation systems specifically for those countries, and yet it could be profitable. So I do believe that we also have a mission, and we also have perhaps a responsibility, while we are very successful in helping the multinationals be more efficient and effective in their supply chains, apply similar type of perspective and principles and turn around and serve the needed, the people who are living in extreme poverty as well. In that way, I think that broadened the mission values that we can bring to the table.
Victor.
Yeah, literally a 2-minute intervention. I thought Hubert raised some very fundamental points. I think there is a trade-off in value added and jobs by the global supply chains. And if you go to the, let's say the example of the iPad that was analyzed, everybody is aware of. You know, what that has shown is the U.S. has kept the lion's share of the value added. And then in a sense, U.S. is now asking for where are the jobs. Now, the same thing actually would apply in the converse from China, because China basically said, for every, I remember Premier Zhurongji used to say, we make 50 cents out of every pair of Nike shoes, and Nike makes $95. Yeah. Why is that right, But sometimes China itself forgets that it's kept the lion's share of the jobs. So there really is a trade-off. The answer is very much this. Well, it's either you want jobs or you want value added. And then if you have a lot of value added, there is a need for your internal process to create the jobs. And Mike Spence will say you need to then think about creating the jobs in the non-tradable sector. And that is the ultimate. I think that's a tremendous. And then on the technology transfer, actually, I beg to differ a little bit with Hubert. One of the important things that has happened in the world is, do you guys just have noticed we no longer talk about the digital divide? That was the big deal 10 years ago. The cost of technology has shrunk to basically nothing. And I think this thing is going to be changing the world. You know, I just found recently China has 730 million mobile phones, right, cell phones, out of 1.3 billion people. I thought that was pretty good. I just found out recently Africa has 1 billion people and 650 million cell phones. The penetration rate in Africa is higher than China. Now, I think that is going to connect the small SMEs to the world. Without bridging the digital divide, there's no hope. But once you can bridge, I think a small emerging enterprise in a developing world can actually access and participate in the global supply chain. And I'm so glad that we no longer talk about the digital divide. And I think that's a huge development that I don't think we focus enough on. And that is actually going to change also the way the work and supply chains will be developing in the whole world as well. Sorry.
No,
I took more than 2 minutes.
No, that's quite all right. You know, there are so many questions and issues that we could be going on at this all day, and not just for the amount of somewhat limited time we have. Lots of other questions come to mind that we've barely touched on, and I thought the best thing now would be to open this up and have a discussion with all of you, because you're obviously going to be very active, so let's get going. Yes.
Thank you. And thanks, Victor.
Yeah.
Just to introduce myself, I'm Anthony Nightingale. Thanks very much, all four of you, for some brilliant insights there. I'd like, if I may, Patrick, to kind of move the discussion forward in one respect, and that is to address the subject of choke points or barriers, because none of you have really talked about that. You've painted quite an optimistic view in many ways, which is great, of how global supply chains are developing. But I'd like to focus for a moment on how could they develop better, and put a proposition and ask you to comment. It seems to me over the last 20-odd years, actually great progress has been made in the trade of physical goods, both in terms of reducing tariffs, whether by means of the WTO or these regional trade agreements that Victor doesn't like very much. But and also a lot of good work on the facilitation side, customs clearance, single window, etc. But the big gap has been a much less effective way of addressing services. And services are already hugely important. They're more than half the economy of many countries in the world, and they account for an increasing part of actual trade. And of course, inside manufactured goods, as the smiley face shows, there are a lot of embedded services, whether it's R&D at the beginning or logistics halfway through or maybe marketing at the end. So again, the proposition I would like to put is, shouldn't we be getting our trade ministers and our organizations? I know WTO's got bogged down. Personally, I think it's not such a bad thing that there's a lot of regional bodies that are also trying to do free trade deals. But we need them to focus on the services area, not just on manufactured goods. That's the proposition, and I'd like to hear your comments.
Can I just say one thing before I invite the panel to respond? For every product breakdown that's been done, including some by ourselves, the services component, or the invisible assets, you can call them what you will, is 2/3 to 3/4 of the story. So you couldn't be more right. Do you want to get more? Okay.
And then we can all...
Yeah, all right. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Mark Brox. I work with the United Nations. And like Victor Fung, I am very much a multilateralist. Well, I come from a multilateral organization. But at the same time, I work for the Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So I also have a regional focus. And what we have seen is over time that there is a strong emergence, not just global value chains, but also regional value chains. And I think that has to do also with the fact that Asia is not only a producing region, but also a consuming region. Now my question is, we have seen this proliferation of these regional and bilateral trade agreements. We work very much in this area and to analyze it. And we have now the noodle bowl, as we know, with all these overlapping rules of origin and overlapping rules. We talked yesterday about all these ASEAN FTAs that we have, ASEAN as a hub, whereas the individual ASEAN countries are also making all kind of FTAs. Now I'm wondering, both the multilateral trading system and all these FTAs are to a large extent government driven. I have two questions about this. First of all, why isn't business more involved in driving this agenda? Because they're the ones in the end that benefit from it. And secondly, given all the supply chains that are out there, which is really a business-driven process, are these RTAs facilitating global supply chains, or are they in response to global supply chains? Thank you.
Let's go to some more questions. Right at the back there.
Yeah, it's me again, but I'm not going to play the Youth card this time. I'm going to play the urban card. I'd like to have your comments actually on a development which I think we need to take into account, the massive urbanization and the importance of cities. You know, we work for many cities, and if I look at all these charts, they still have nation flags, but isn't, you know, added actually complexity to your model of you cannot just produce in China and sell in the United States, a new dimension, even another dimension, more complexity, that you don't want to sell your product in Kansas City, but you want to sell it in Chengdu. Or, you know, a certain part of northeastern Germany shrinking is actually not interesting for you because it's poorer than parts of Hyderabad in India. So the question of, you know, cities as major points of GDP, not only production but also consummation, adds to this massive complexity of value chain, because countries no longer probably are the real measurements, but, you know, mega cities or very important, you know, booming cities are sometimes important for you, and other cities who are shrinking in the same countries are totally unimportant to you, adding to the complexity. Love to hear your comments on this.
We've got two from the front here, and then one over there, and then we'll take a pause and do something. Yeah.
Hi, this is Chang Yong-ri. I'm a Chief Economist at Asian Development Bank. I think the issue of the supply chain, global supply chain, was highlighted after the Japan's earthquake and the supply chain disruptions. So I just want to get your view of how whether it's really risky, because after the Japan's earthquake, actually, in fact, we actually didn't see very much disruptions, more than we expected. And that is quite in contrast with the financial, you know, crisis, where the more integration, more linkages among financial institutions cause lots of problem. So do you see any risk side?
One here.
I'm Cliff Tan from the Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi. I just have, that was actually one of my questions, but the other one I wanted to ask is, what role does intellectual property protection play in terms of an obstacle to expanding supply chains? Because your example about the Cisco Viking server, it occurs to me that it'd be very easy to hire a couple of those guys and bring them over to Huawei, and then where would you go? And I was sorry. I've been thinking a little bit about Taiwan-Chinese partnership lately, and thinking about some very basic R&D that they could do together, you know, and just sort of regular production processes and chemicals and other places. But then I found myself stopped by thinking, well, can they depend on their Chinese partners in terms of intellectual property protection?
Okay, Chin, and then we'll have
CL Lim, Hong Kong University. When Victor mentioned that the United States was taking the lion's share of value add but crying job losses, people laughed politely. But for democratic countries, I suppose it's quite difficult to point to job losses being justified by earnings per share. I think, my question is Asia different? Is authoritarian Asia different, where we just tell you that it's good for earnings per share?
Okay, we've got a question on services, regionalism, urbanization, internal supply chains as well as international ones. Risk, I should mention that risk is going to feature prominently in the next panel on supply chains. IP, intellectual property, and again the jobs value added relationship. So why don't we go across the panelists and have a shot at these ones, and then we'll be able to come back to the audience.
I'll just pick up one or two of the ones that I perhaps have some knowledge of. I think services is a very, very exciting topic, important topic. And I believe that besides what you already propose, the importance of maybe trade ministers looking at it and paying the same level of attention like the physical supply chain, I think we as industry leaders should also look at services in the same way like looking at the physical products. In the past, the physical products were able to leverage the power of the global supply chain mainly because people have paid attention to how to design products so that they can become highly modular. The picture that I think is shown here is that because the product has become a highly modular in structure, so that you can decompose the product and make in India for this piece, made in Pakistan, this piece China, and eventually integrate them back. So we have to do the same thing with services, and we just haven't paid attention to design of services so that the whole service package, if one day we're able to decompose them, then we can have this service done here and there, and then we can integrate them back, and we can have much more parallel processing and leveraging the power of the different pockets of excellence. And I think that's an opportunity, looking at service the same way as looking at a physical product. On the intellectual property, it's always a concern, but yet at the same time, you look at these very successful companies like Cisco and Microsoft and their HP, they're already leveraging those design expertise that are in these emerging economies. And how can they protect that? Of course, I think once in a while there were always some cases that ended up in the court where infringements occurred and there are some IP leakages. Nothing can be protected 100%, but yet companies like Cisco highly protect the integration process, so that even if you have the individual pieces, but if you do not know how to integrate them well together, and you only have stolen one or two pieces, it's very hard for you to still reconstruct the whole product. So it means that I think there's always a concern, but yet you have to weigh the balance between the positive side of leveraging the potential innovative capabilities and the design capabilities of these new economies and the risk of having some IP leakage. So you do it by weighing the pros and cons and the positive and the negatives, and at the same time maybe spend efforts in the integration portion so that you can still have the bulk of the protection being in your hands. So, but it's not a bulletproof thing. There are always some cases of leakages. Yeah.
Victor, would you like to take up any of these questions?
Should I let everybody?
You want to finish off with more time at the end, you mean?
No.
I'm only kidding.
No, I thought I may not have to say anything at the end.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to bring some element of answer or perhaps comments to a few of them. On services, Fung, and here I take back my hat of statistician. When we try to disentangle trade in global value chain and really measure where the value is created, here the services are coming big. I mean, it's especially important for developed countries when they export manufacture. In theory, I mean, according to traditional statistics, it's a car. But when you look at the value added in the car, you realize that more than 50% are services. And it's where the jobs are, especially in developed economies. I mean, 80% of the jobs are in services. So it's true that we still have issues understanding services because they're immaterial, they're difficult to measure, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the big result of our effort of measuring trade in value added is really putting services at the center of the picture, both as facilitators. I mean, it's logistic, it's trade facilitation, etc., but also in the content of the value. So my first comment on the role of RTAs. here perhaps Patrick, who conducted a research 2 years ago on RTA, could be better placed than me to answer. But from what we understand from WTO is that global value chain may be the driving factor behind the signature of RTAs. And it also answers a concern about intellectual property. And one of the reasons we see business people pushing more for bilateral or regional trade agreement rather than the multilateral negotiation is that some of the business community concerns on competitive regulation, IP protection, etc., are better treated or more